The moon was desolate, a place where only silence echoed, broken only by the crackling flames of a shipwreck. The ship had crashed not long ago, and the debris was scattered across the barren, rocky surface. The ruins of the once proud vessel now lay in ruins, torn apart by the violence of a battle that had been fought above the stars. Far above, the final remnants of the fight were still unfolding in the sky. But down here, on the surface, there was only devastation. Among the twisted wreckage of the ship, amidst the smoking ruins, a young alien princess lay, badly wounded. Zaira, the heir to the Zorathian Empire, had once been the pride of her people, strong, intelligent, and poised to lead. But now, in the cold of space, she lay abandoned, left to die alone. The air around her smelled of burning metal and scorched earth. The battle had been brutal, and the betrayal had been worse. Her own people, the Zorathians, had turned on her after they had realized her allegiance to the humans was more important than her birthright. She could still remember the pain of the last moments aboard her ship, the moment when her closest advisor had stabbed her in the back. "Your loyalty lies with these lesser creatures," he had sneered as he turned his back on her, leaving her to face the wrath of the Zorathian fleet alone. Her once proud people had discarded her, throwing her away like she was nothing more than an obstacle. The very ones she had trusted had betrayed her. And now, here she was, lying in the dust, her once glorious future nothing but a shattered dream. As her body trembled from the blood loss, Kyra tried to focus. The pain was unbearable, her limbs weak and uncooperative. The darkness seemed to swallow her every time she tried to close her eyes. She could feel the life slipping from her body, but she couldn't let go. Not yet. Not when she knew there was a chance she could survive. She heard something. A sound, soft at first, but growing louder. Footsteps. Someone was coming. She tensed, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. Her mind was clouded by panic. Was it the enemy? Were they coming to finish what her people had started? The thought of more betrayal made her stomach churn. She closed her eyes, willing herself to fade into the shadows, hoping whoever it was would simply ignore her broken form and pass by. But the footsteps grew closer. She could hear the faint clinking of metal and the soft hum of machinery. It wasn't the heavy stomp of an enemy soldier. It was something different, lighter, more purposeful. She forced her eyes open just as a figure appeared from the smoke and debris. For a moment, she thought she was seeing things. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the rugged uniform of a human soldier. His face was hardened by years of war, but there was something in his eyes that made Kyra hesitate, a kind of resolve, a determination she hadn't seen in anyone, not even her own people. The human soldier stopped in front of her. His helmet was off, revealing short-cropped brown hair and a scar running across his cheek. His eyes, dark, like the void of space, studied her for a moment. He didn't speak, just took in the sight of her, weak, battered, and broken. But there was no fear in his gaze, only an overwhelming sense of purpose. "You're going to make it," he muttered to himself, more to reassure himself than her. He didn't hesitate. Reaching down, he scooped her up in his arms. Zaira could feel her strength slipping further away, her vision blurring, but there was something comforting about the way he held her. It wasn't pity, it wasn't arrogance, it was just a quiet determination, like he wasn't going to let her die here, not if he had anything to say about it. He started moving, carrying her away from the wreckage, toward his ship. Zaira barely registered the movement, too weak to even hold her head up. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he was helping her, a princess of a dying empire, a traitor in the eyes of her people. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat was dry, her body cold. Everything seemed to slip away. But then, as the world began to fade into darkness, she felt the steady pressure of his hands on her. She felt warmth, and for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of safety. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make her hold on to consciousness. if only for a little longer. The soldier's ship was waiting for them, a small vessel that seemed insignificant against the vast emptiness of space. But to Xyra, it felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could breathe again. As he moved swiftly across the moon's surface, Xyra couldn't help but wonder what kind of man this was, this human soldier who had chosen to save her. What had driven him to risk his life for a princess of a race that had once mocked humans as nothing more than insects? The soldier didn't waste time with pleasantries. He hurried her into the ship and laid her down on one of the medical tables. His hands were quick as he began to assess her injuries, applying pressure to the worst of her wounds. She tried to speak, to ask him why he had come for her, but her voice was little more than a whisper. "Rest," the soldier said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You'll be safe." Safe? Could she ever be safe again? She had no home, no people. The Zorethians had abandoned her, left her to die alone. And yet here was this human, this stranger, who was doing everything in his power to keep her alive. She didn't understand it. She didn't know if she ever would. But she didn't have the strength to fight it. She didn't have the strength to do anything. The soldier worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision. Xyra felt herself drifting in and out of consciousness, but she never lost the sense of his presence. His steady movements, his calm demeanor were the only things that kept her tethered to the world. And despite everything she had endured, despite the betrayal, despite the war, she found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the human soldier continued his work, a distant sound filled the ship's cabin, dreadful, low, and mechanical. Enemy ships were closing in. The Zorethians hadn't given up on her. They knew she had survived, and they were coming to finish what they had started. Xyra's heart raced as she struggled to sit up, but her strength failed her. She could feel the weight of the coming battle bearing down on them. The soldier didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He knew the risks of helping her, but there was no turning back now. The enemy would soon be upon them, and his chances of escape were slim. But there was something in his eyes as he turned toward her. Something that told her he wouldn't leave her behind, no matter what. Xyra knew the danger, but she also knew that with this human soldier, there was a chance. Maybe not for her people, maybe not for the Zorethian Empire, but for her. For the first time since the betrayal, she had something to fight for. The ship's engines roared to life, and as they broke free from the surface of the moon, Xyra's mind raced. She had no idea what would happen next. But for the first time, she felt the stirring of something inside her, a desire to survive, to escape the life that had betrayed her, and perhaps to find a new purpose in the chaos that awaited them both. The countdown to their escape had begun, and the soldier, Jax Hale, was ready to fight for her, and so was she. The hum of the ship's engines filled the air as it cut through the vast emptiness of space, carrying both the human soldier and the injured alien princess to safety. Or so it seemed. Inside the ship, the tension was palpable. Xyra, the once proud princess of the Zorethian Empire, lay on the medical table, her body still battered and bruised, her wounds tended to but far from healed. Despite the quick work of the human soldier, Jax Hale, she remained still, her eyes closed in uneasy slumber. She was in a foreign place, surrounded by technology that was not her own, and she couldn't afford to trust him. Not yet. Jax stood at the controls of the ship, monitoring the navigation systems, occasionally glancing over at Xyra. He could sense her mistrust, even though she was unconscious. The tension between them was thick, but he knew that saving her, helping her, was the right thing to do. He had no idea what the Zorethians had done to her, but the pain in her eyes before she had lost consciousness told him everything he needed to know. She was more than just a victim of war. She was a survivor. Jax had seen countless battles, lost friends, and faced enemies far more dangerous than anything the galaxy had thrown at him. But this was different. He wasn't fighting for Earth or for his people. He was fighting for someone else's survival. Someone who had been abandoned. someone who had been betrayed by her own. And for the first time in a long while, Jax felt a weight on his shoulders that wasn't just about his own survival. The ship glided through space with an eerie quietness, its sleek frame cutting through the starry expanse as they ventured deeper into unknown territory. Jax glanced back at Xyra as she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she was disoriented, as though she couldn't remember where she was. "Where am I?" Kyra's voice was weak, hoarse from the damage she had taken, but there was still strength in it. She tried to sit up, but the pain from her injuries made her wince, and she collapsed back onto the table. "You're safe, for now," Jax replied, keeping his voice calm, though there was a hint of urgency. "We're in my ship. I'll take care of you. Just rest." Xyra's gaze was sharp despite her exhaustion. She glared at him, suspicion evident in her eyes. "I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's help." Jax paused, surprised by the coldness in her words. He understood her distrust. After all, she had just been betrayed by those closest to her, the very people who should have protected her. He couldn't imagine what that must have felt like. But he wasn't like them. He had no intention of using her, no intention of betraying her. She was a living being, not an object to be discarded. "I didn't help you to expect anything in return," Jax said, his voice steady and firm. "I saw you, and I knew you needed help. Simple as that." Xyra scoffed, her pride flaring up despite her situation. "You're just another human. You think you can save me? What could you possibly know of loss, of being betrayed by your own people?" Jax didn't flinch. He had been through his own share of pain, of loss, and he wasn't afraid to share it with her if it would help. He had never been one for stories, but maybe, just maybe, it would help her understand that he wasn't just a soldier with a mission. "I lost people too," Jax said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his memories. "My family, my squad. I've been through it, trust me. But we all fight for something bigger than ourselves, for something worth living for, even when you feel like there's nothing left." Xyra stared at him, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to, but the walls she had built around herself after the betrayal were too high, too strong. Trust didn't come easily to someone who had lost everything. Her empire, her people, they were gone. Left in the wake of the war, abandoned by the ones she thought would protect her. But Jax wasn't like them. He wasn't like her people. His words weren't empty. There was a sincerity in his eyes that made her hesitate. Maybe he wasn't so different from her after all. As the ship sped through the void, the sense of impending danger loomed over them both. Xyra could feel it, the familiar sense of dread she had experienced when the Zorathians had turned on her. Her people were still out there, hunting her. She had no doubt that their ships were already closing in on her location, drawn by the signal from Jax's ship. The Zorathians would not let her escape. She could already hear their warships in the distance, their engines reverberating through space like the approach of an inevitable storm. "We need to move faster," she said, her voice now more urgent. She was no longer the cold, distant princess. Now there was something more in her tone, a sense of survival. "They're coming. The Zorathians won't stop until they've destroyed everything in their path." Jax's expression hardened, his fingers flying over the controls as he adjusted the ship's course. "I know, but I'll make sure they don't get you. We're not going down without a fight." Xyra's gaze softened slightly. Despite herself, she was beginning to believe him. Perhaps there was a chance for both of them. Maybe they could survive this. Maybe they could fight back. She had no love for the Zorathians, no loyalty left to the empire that had betrayed her. And now, with Jax by her side, she wasn't alone. They were an unlikely pair, he, a human soldier, and she, a fallen princess of an alien empire. But in that moment, they were something more. Survivors. Two beings from different worlds, united by a common cause. As the ship pushed forward, Xyra could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't just the threat of the Zorathians closing in. It was the quiet understanding that had begun to form between her and Jax. There was a bond, fragile but real, forged in the fires of war and betrayal. She had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't facing it alone. And that, in itself, felt like a small victory. The distant hum of enemy ships grew louder, but so did the resolve in their hearts. They were ready. Together, they would face whatever was coming. And whatever the future held, they were no longer enemies. They were allies. The hum of the engines grew louder as Jax Hale tightened his grip on the ship's controls. His heart raced, and his eyes flickered between the blinking lights and data on the dashboard. He had been running for hours, navigating through asteroid fields and trying to stay ahead of the relentless Zorethian fleet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up. Behind him, Syra lay motionless, her body still battered, but her mind was beginning to stir. The alien princess, once a beacon of power in her empire, had become a fugitive, a broken soul with nowhere to go. Yet, as Jax fought to keep the ship steady, something began to shift in her. Her powers, which had been dormant ever since the attack on her ship, started to awaken. It was subtle at first, a faint hum in the air, a glow from her fingertips. Jax glanced over his shoulder. "You're awake," he said, his voice tinged with relief, but also concern. "I'm not fully healed," Kyra replied, her voice weak, but gaining strength. "But I can help. I have abilities that may assist us in evading them." Jax nodded, his face a mixture of wariness and hope. He had no idea what her powers entailed, but at this point, he would take any advantage he could get. As the Zorethian ships closed in, their massive shadows looming over the tiny human vessel, Syra reached out with her hands, her fingers hovering just above the ship's control panel. The air around her seemed to ripple, and the ship's systems flickered to life, responding to her alien touch. The ship's cloak activated, a shimmering field surrounding them, masking their presence from the enemy. The ship's engines hummed louder as the power from Syra's abilities flowed through the systems. The once sluggish controls now felt lighter, more responsive. Jax could feel the change instantly, as if the ship itself was becoming more alive under their combined efforts. "Hold on," Jax muttered under his breath as he pushed the throttle forward. The ship surged forward, narrowly dodging a volley of enemy fire. But the Zorethians were relentless. The enemy captain's voice crackled over the comms, mocking Jax's efforts. "Human, you think you can escape us? You are nothing but a speck of dust in the path of the storm. Your ship will be destroyed, and your princess will be returned to her rightful place." The captain's laughter echoed in the silence of space, filled with an arrogance that made Jax's blood boil. "I don't care what you think," Jax growled, his eyes narrowing as he steered the ship sharply to avoid another barrage of laser fire. "I'm not going down without a fight." The enemy ships moved in, their massive forms casting long shadows over the small human ship. The Zorethian fleet was equipped with advanced weaponry, laser cannons, missile launchers, and the dreaded plasma torpedoes that could tear a ship to pieces in seconds. They were strong. They were many. But Jax was determined. And with Zyra's alien technology at their side, he wasn't ready to give up just yet. "We need to get closer," Jax muttered, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "I'll try to break their formation. You handle the tech. They won't know what hit them." Syra nodded, her expression grim but resolute. Her alien powers surged again, and the cloaking technology flickered in and out as they danced with danger, narrowly evading enemy shots. The Zorethians were not used to being outmaneuvered. They had superior technology, but they had never faced a human willing to sacrifice everything for survival. Jax's heart raced as he pushed the ship's engines to their limit. The ship groaned in protest, but it held steady, powered by both Jax's relentless will and the otherworldly energy that Syra brought. But the Zorethians weren't giving up that easily. A pair of enemy drones detached from the larger warships, their metallic forms glinting menacingly as they closed in on the human ship. "Incoming," Jax shouted, flipping a switch to activate the ship's defense systems. But it was too late. The drones breached the outer hull, and before Jax could react, they were inside the ship. "Get ready," Jax shouted, grabbing his weapon from the console. He looked at Syra, who was already on her feet, her alien eyes glowing with determination. The drones were fast, their sleek bodies darting through the narrow corridors of the ship. The sound of metal clashing against metal echoed as they clashed with Jax and Syra. Jax fired first, his shots precise, hitting one of the drones square in the chest. But there were more. As one drone fell, another two emerged, advancing with relentless speed. Zyra's powers flared as she pushed herself into the fight. With a swift movement, her hands glowed with energy, and she sent a wave of telekinetic force into the drones, throwing one across the room and into the wall. The other advanced on her, but before it could strike, Jax intervened, taking it down with a quick shot to the head. Despite the chaos, there was something unspoken between them. They fought as one, their movements synchronized as though they had known each other for years. Jax's quick reflexes and Syra's alien abilities made them a formidable pair, unstoppable in their combined strength. Every blow, every shot, every move felt like a shared victory. As the last of the drones fell, Jax turned to Syra, his breath heavy. "You're incredible," he said, his voice laced with awe. Zyra gave him a small, tired smile, her gaze softening. "And you are more resilient than I expected, human." But the battle wasn't over. Outside the ship, the Zorathian fleet was regrouping, preparing for another attack. The calm before the storm was over. The ship had survived, but they were far from safe. "Let's go," Jax said, his jaw set in determination. "We're not done yet." Zyra nodded, her powers still at the ready as she powered up the ship's systems. They were no longer just a human and an alien. They were allies, fighting side by side, willing to risk everything to survive. And together, they would face whatever came next. The final showdown had arrived. The abandoned space station, a once vibrant hub of Zorathian activity, now stood eerily silent, its halls filled only with the hum of malfunctioning machinery and the distant sound of enemy footsteps. Jax, Hale, and Syra stood side by side, their backs pressed against the cold, crumbling walls. Both were bruised, battered, and exhausted, but there was no turning back now. The Zorathian fleet was closing in, and this would be their last stand. The enemy's elite forces had tracked them down, and now they were determined to finish what they had started. Jax and Syra had barely managed to evade the initial wave of attacks, but the station was falling apart around them, its structural integrity failing. Every moment, the walls groaned as if the station itself were protesting their presence. The only thing standing between them and certain death was their will to survive, and each other. Jax's pulse pounded in his ears as he steadied his breathing. His weapon was drawn, his fingers trembling slightly from the strain of constant combat. But he wasn't thinking about his injuries or the pain that was creeping into his side. His only focus was on Syra, who stood beside him, her alien powers glowing faintly as she prepared herself for the coming battle. "We have to move quickly," Jax said, his voice low but firm. "The station's about to collapse. We don't have much time." Zyra nodded, her alien eyes scanning the darkened corridor ahead. She was already bracing herself, her mind focused and determined. She had come a long way from the cold, distant princess she once was. Now, standing here with Jax, she felt something different, something powerful. A connection. A bond forged in battle, yes, but also in compassion. As the enemy forces emerged from the shadows, Jax and Syra sprang into action. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hallways as Jax fired at the approaching soldiers, his aim precise despite his fatigue. Syra moved with an otherworldly grace, her powers allowing her to manipulate the environment around them. She lifted pieces of debris, hurling them at the enemies with deadly precision, sending several soldiers flying. But the fight was far from over. As more Zorethian soldiers rushed forward, Jax was forced to make a stand. He pushed Syra behind him, taking the brunt of the attack as the enemies closed in. He fought back fiercely, but the weight of exhaustion was beginning to catch up to him. The cuts on his arms burned with each movement, and blood seeped through his shirt. Then, as a Zorethian soldier aimed a deadly plasma rifle at Syra, Jax reacted without thinking. He dove in front of her, taking the full force of the blast to his chest. Pain erupted through him, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. "Jax!" Syra cried, her voice filled with panic. Through blurred vision, Jax saw Syra rush to his side, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. The wound was severe, and the blood was pouring from his chest at an alarming rate. His vision blurred further, his strength fading as the pain took over. He reached up, his fingers brushing her arm weakly. "You need to keep fighting," he whispered. "You're the only one who can." Syra shook her head desperately, tears welling in her eyes. "No, Jax, I can't lose you. You've given everything for me." Jax smiled weakly, even as the darkness crept closer. "It was worth it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I believe in you, in us." But Syra's heart was torn. The station was collapsing, and the enemy was closing in. Her emotions, once held firmly in check, now surged through her like a tidal wave. She could feel her powers growing stronger, but they weren't enough to keep them both alive. She had to make a choice: continue the fight and take down the Zorethian forces, or save the man who had become so much more than just an ally. With tears streaming down her face, Syra closed her eyes. Her mind was filled with images of her past, the grandeur of her royal life, the throne she had been promised, the endless years of training, and the cold detachment of her people. She had been a princess, above it all, but now she was something else. She was human in a way she had never imagined. Her connection to Jax, his bravery, his humanity, had changed her. She realized that it wasn't just her survival that mattered. She placed both hands on Jax's chest, drawing upon the power within her. Her fingers glowed with a brilliant, otherworldly light as she channeled all her energy into him. At first, nothing happened. But then, Jax's breath caught, and his body twitched as the wound on his chest began to close. The blood flow slowed, and the pain that had clouded his mind began to ease. He opened his eyes, staring up at Syra with disbelief. "Syra, you saved me," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Syra's heart ached as she looked down at him. She could feel the weight of the choice she had made, the risk she had taken. If she had failed, if her powers hadn't been enough, they both would have died there, on that crumbling station. But somehow, against all odds, she had saved him. And in that moment, she knew it was more than just an act of survival. It was an act of love. "I couldn't lose you, Jax," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You've shown me what it means to care for another life, to fight for something bigger than yourself." Jax reached up, his hand trembling as he touched her cheek. "And you've shown me that I'm not just a soldier anymore. I'm someone who has something worth fighting for." Syra took a deep breath, her powers still humming with energy. She glanced around them. The station was beginning to shake violently, the walls cracking as debris fell from above. There was no time left. "Come on," she said, helping him to his feet. "We have to get out of here now." As the two of them stumbled through the collapsing station, the enemy forces continued to pursue them, but they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for each other, for the bond they had forged in the face of impossible odds. Together, they would escape. Together, they would find a new future, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The battle had reached its boiling point. Above them, in the endless void of space, a storm of explosions and fire illuminated the darkness. The enemy's forces, vast and merciless, launched their final assault, determined to crush Jax and Syra before they could escape the trap that had been set for them. The air around them was thick with tension, and every moment felt like it could be their last. Jax, now slightly recovered from the brutal injuries he had sustained earlier, stood at the helm of the small human ship, his eyes sharp and focused. The pain from his wounds still lingered, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his heart. Beside him, Syra was a force to be reckoned with. The princess, who had once been cold and calculating, now radiated power, her alien abilities crackling with energy. The small bond they had formed had transformed into something much deeper, a shared purpose, a shared will to fight for their survival. Together, they were ready to face whatever the enemy threw at them. As the enemy forces closed in, their ships darkened the skies above, ready to unleash their devastating firepower. The colossal warships hung ominously in orbit, their weapons primed and ready. Syra's eyes glowed with intensity, and her hands hovered over the ship's controls, her alien powers now in full force. She had come a long way from the royal princess who had once looked down on humanity. Now she was an unstoppable warrior, driven by the need to protect and the desire to avenge those who had wronged her. "Jax," Syra said, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos outside. "We can't let them keep pushing us back. We need to fight back harder." Jax nodded, gripping the ship's controls tightly. "I'm with you. We do this together." With a fierce determination, Syra manipulated the ship's systems with her powers, activating the cloaking device and pushing their small craft into a series of evasive maneuvers. The enemy's massive warships loomed large on their sensors, each one packing enough firepower to obliterate them in a single shot. But the human ship, though small and vulnerable, was fast and agile, darting through space like a deadly predator. The enemy commander's voice crackled over the communication channel, mocking their attempts to escape. "You can't run forever, humans. The Zorathian fleet will hunt you down, no matter where you hide. Your fight is over." But Jax and Syra weren't backing down. They had come too far. They had already fought their way through impossible odds, and they weren't about to stop now. As the enemy warship loomed closer, Jax gritted his teeth, steering their ship into a high-speed dive toward the station below. The Zorathian warship, in pursuit, launched an orbital bombardment, sending explosive rounds raining down on the space station they had taken refuge in. The first explosion was deafening, shaking the entire station. The shockwave rippled through space, sending debris scattering like shooting stars. Syra's hands glowed brightly as she conjured a powerful energy shield, deflecting the incoming fire from the bombardment. Jax fired back, his ship's weapons firing with pinpoint accuracy. Each shot found its mark, tearing through enemy drones and enemy vessels with lethal precision. But the battle wasn't just taking place in space, it was also happening on the station below. The enemy had breached the station's defenses, and now Jax and Syra were surrounded. The walls of the station groaned as the explosions rocked it, and the station's remaining corridors were filled with smoke and dust. The two of them fought side by side, taking down wave after wave of enemy forces in a series of intense close-quarters combat sequences. Jax moved like a shadow, his combat skills honed through years of fighting. His every movement was precise, every strike deadly. Syra's alien powers were in full force as well, her energy blasts tearing through enemies with ease. Together, they were a whirlwind of destruction, unstoppable in their mission to survive. The backdrop of the station collapsing around them made the battle even more intense. Exploding ships and falling debris created a chaotic landscape as they fought through the wreckage. Jax's weapon fired with steady rhythm, picking off enemies with deadly accuracy. Syra's powers shielded them from incoming blasts, deflecting enemy fire and sending it back toward their attackers. In one particularly brutal moment, an enemy soldier lunged at Syra with a plasma blade, but she reacted instantly, disarming him with a swift kick and sending him flying across the room. She didn't hesitate, moving on to the next enemy with a fluidity that made it seem like she had been fighting for years. Jax, meanwhile, found himself face to face with an enemy commander, a Zorathian warrior who had clearly been trained in hand-to-hand combat. They clashed violently, their weapons clanging as they exchanged blow after blow. Jax's fist connected with the Zorathian's jaw, sending him staggering backward, but the enemy soldier quickly recovered and lunged forward, swinging his weapon with deadly intent. For a split second, it seemed as though Jax was outmatched. But just as the enemy commander was about to strike, Zaira intervened, using her powers to knock the Zorathian off balance. Jax took advantage of the opening, delivering a final blow that sent the enemy crashing to the ground. With the commander taken down, the two of them pressed on, cutting their way through the remaining enemies. The enemy forces were relentless, but so were Jax and Kyra. With each passing moment, they grew stronger together. The orbital bombardment continued, but they refused to be defeated. The station's walls continued to crack and collapse, but they held their ground, fighting with everything they had. The sheer force of their will was enough to push them forward. Each blow they landed another step toward victory. At long last, the enemy forces began to retreat. Their warship, severely damaged and losing power, began to fall back, its remaining drones scattering as they sought cover. Jax and Kyra stood together, breathing heavily but victorious. The battle had been brutal, but they had survived. Against all odds, they had fought not just for their survival, but for each other. And as the space station continued to crumble, their bond had been solidified in the heat of battle, a bond that could never be broken. But the fight was far from over. They had won this battle, but they both knew that the war was far from finished. The Zorathian forces would not give up easily. But for now, they had achieved the impossible. And together, they would face whatever came next, united in their strength, their courage, and their shared determination to survive. The final battle was over. The vast expanse of space was still and eerily quiet, but the wreckage of the enemy warships scattered across the darkness told a different story. The once untouchable Zorathian forces were broken, their grand plans for destruction thwarted by the combined strength of two unlikely allies. The overwhelming power of the enemy had faltered in the face of human resilience and alien technology, and now all that was left was the debris of their defeat. Jax and Kyra stood on the bridge of their battered ship, their eyes scanning the wreckage that surrounded them. It had been a brutal fight, one that had cost them both dearly, but it had also proven something much greater: the power of unity, and the incredible strength that arose when enemies became allies. The enemy captain, once a close confidant of Kyra, had fallen at their hands. His betrayal had nearly cost them everything, but now, in this quiet moment, the weight of it all seemed to lift. The Zorathian forces had retreated, their morale shattered by the defeat. The grand fleet that had once loomed so menacingly above them was no more. It had been reduced to a sea of wreckage, drifting aimlessly in space, a silent testament to the might of those who had refused to bow. The enemy's arrogance had led them to underestimate their opponents, humans and Zorathians alike. And in the end, it was that underestimation that sealed their fate. Zaira, now standing tall beside Jax, had come a long way from the princess she had once been. Her eyes no longer burned with the cold ambition of royalty. Instead, they burned with the fire of someone who had been reborn, someone who had seen the very worst of her own people, but had fought alongside humanity to carve a new path. No longer was she simply a princess of an empire that had betrayed her, but a warrior, an ally to humanity, and perhaps something more. Her transformation was evident in the way she carried herself. The cold, calculating princess had been replaced by a fierce fighter, someone who had learned what it truly meant to fight for something larger than herself. She no longer wore her royal status as a shield, but as a reminder of the past she had left behind. The power of her alien abilities, combined with the resilience she had found in humanity, had turned her into a force to be reckoned with. Jax, for his part, had proven that despite being just a human soldier, he was as capable of greatness as anyone. He had fought through unimaginable pain and adversity, using his wits, his strength, and his heart to lead them both through the most dangerous of situations. He had done it all without the advanced technology or vast resources that the enemy had at their disposal. In the end, it was his determination, his ability to see beyond the surface, and his willingness to sacrifice that had made him Zyra's equal. They shared a quiet moment, standing together in the bridge of the ship, the wreckage of the enemy fleet floating silently around them. There was no need for words, as the weight of their shared victory spoke louder than anything they could say. The universe, once so uncertain and dangerous, now seemed filled with endless possibilities. They had forged a bond in the fires of battle, one that would endure no matter what challenges lay ahead. Looking out into the vastness of space, Jax felt a sense of peace, a rare moment of calm after the storm. The stars seemed to glow brighter now, as if reflecting the new world that was being built. The future was uncertain, but it was no longer a future filled with fear. It was a future filled with hope, with the promise of new adventures and new beginnings. Zyra stood next to him, her eyes fixed on the stars. She had been through so much: betrayal, loss, and the destruction of everything she had known. But now she felt a sense of freedom, a freedom that had come at a great cost, but was worth every sacrifice. For the first time in a long time, she felt that she had a place in this universe. It wasn't the throne she had once sought, but it was something much more powerful, a place by Jax's side, fighting for something worth living for. Jax turned to her, a small smile on his lips. "We've only just begun," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet strength. Zyra glanced at him, her eyes softening. There was a warmth in her gaze now, a flicker of something deeper, something more than just camaraderie. She had come to trust him, to rely on him in ways she never thought possible. He had been her savior, her ally, and in this moment he was much more. Together, they had built something that was stronger than either of them alone. "We've only just begun," she repeated, her voice filled with conviction. It was a promise to herself, to Jax, and to the future they would build together. As the scene faded to black, the camera lingered on the wreckage of the enemy fleet, a visual symbol of their defeat. The stars, once a cold and distant expanse, now felt a little closer, a little more welcoming. The battle had been won, but the war for the future was just beginning. Together, Jax and Zyra would face whatever came next. Together, as equals, as allies, and perhaps, one day, as something even more.